Hey everybody, welcome to the world of weather. We are talking about storm surge and we're also going to talk about the tides. So, if you're a big beach goer like I am and you're always fascinated by the oceans and the tides, this is a lesson you'll really want to watch, and it's super interesting, and it's something even a lot of adults don't know. Why there's high tides and low tides and why the ocean comes up and comes down. So as I'm talking here, I'm actually logging into our CBS 46 Facebook page because I want to be able to open this and answer your questions. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So this will be open right here. And we're going to talk a little bit about the oceans. We're going to talk about storm surge because we are in the middle of hurricane week. If you've missed the past two lessons, this is when you're really going to want to go back and watch. If you are interested in hurricanes, how hurricanes form, why hurricanes are given the names they're given, what makes a hurricane strong. Yesterday we talked about hurricanes in Georgia and why we don't get a lot of hurricanes making landfall on the Georgia coast, but we still are impacted by hurricanes and how. So make sure you watch those lessons. Today we're talking about storm surge, which is one of the biggest threats for hurricanes as they move onshore. And storm surge is basically the ocean water going way higher than normal and moving onshore and causing some pretty major devastation depending on how high the storm surge is and when it happens, whether it's high tide, low tide. So that's why we're going to be talking about tides. We're going to give a quick reviewer here to remind you. So one spin of the Earth is 24 hours a day. So quick refresher: the Earth spins, as you know, spins on its axis, and it spins one complete revolution every 24 hours. So that's why a day is 24 hours long. Now, because of that, that is also why we have usually two high tides and two low tides in a 24-hour period. So you get the high tide twice and the low tide twice, and it's every about 6 hours you have changes of the tides. Have you ever gone to the beach with your mom and dad, or gone to the beach and you set your stuff up? You have your umbrella, you have your toys, you have your chairs, you have everything you need, and you're playing for hours. All of a sudden, the ocean water starts coming closer and closer and closer. And then all of a sudden, your toys are floating in the middle of the ocean. Has that ever happened to you? I know it's happened to me, along with my chairs. That's exactly what high tide and low tide is. When the water is very far down, that's the low tide. And then as that water slowly starts to build up until it gets to the top, and that's when your stuff starts floating away, that is high tide. And again, every 6 hours, you see that change. And the high tide and low tide times are always different. And it all is because of the moon. Did you know that? It's the moon that is causing the high tide and the low tide. It's the gravitational pull of the moon. So here's our globe. Let's pretend this is my computer mouse, that this is the moon. Last time I used an orange wrapped in foil, but I don't have that this time. We're just going to use this. So the moon circles around the Earth, and at the same time, the Earth is turning, right? Because it turns one full rotation in 24 hours. Now, the areas closest to the moon, it's the gravitational pull of the moon. So let's say the moon is right here. Let's get the United States. Let's say there's the United States, that the moon is over here, facing the globe on this side. Then you're going to have high tide on this side of the Earth and on the back side of the Earth. So the gravitational pull from the moon causes high tide. That's why it's every 6 hours on this side of the globe and the complete opposite side of the globe. Then it's the opposite over here. So if the moon is still here, this part of the globe and this part of the globe have low tide. So that's why it's constantly changing every 6 hours. The moon is actually pulling that ocean water. The gravity of the moon is pulling that ocean water towards the moon, and that's why you get the high tide. So when you're closest to the moon and furthest from the moon, you have high tide, and then the other areas of the globe are seeing low tide. So that's how it kind of works. I have some graphics to explain it further. And the reason we're talking about the tides, and you're saying, Jen, we're talking about hurricanes, why are you talking about tides? Because if you have a hurricane moving onshore during a high tide, it's going to be way more devastating than if you have a hurricane moving onshore during a low tide. Remember, low tide is when that water's really low and you have a huge beach behind you, when you have all that sand. So that gives you a lot more height that you can deal with a storm surge. On the other hand, if the water's already all the way up the beach, all the way to the top, and then you get a storm surge on top of that, you can get some pretty major devastation. So when we're forecasting hurricanes, we're not only looking at the strength of the hurricane, the winds of the hurricane, where the hurricane is making landfall, but we're also looking at when it makes landfall. The timing is really key, because if the hurricane makes landfall during high tide or when that ocean level is higher, it's going to be much more significant as far as damage and flooding than if that hurricane makes landfall when it's low tide. So as you can imagine, there's lots of little bits of moving pieces as we're forecasting hurricanes. So that's the general outline of what we're talking about. Now we're going to go through graphics. So we're going to go a little more in depth, and maybe it will help you understand the high tide and the low tide a little better. So we're going to back this up on the computer, and it's time for our World of Weather lesson, which today is storm surge, which is, again, one of the biggest issues for a hurricane for coastal areas. So storm surge is not going to affect us in North Georgia. It's not going to affect the North Georgia mountains, but it is going to impact the coast. So storm surge is what? What is a storm surge? Storm surge is the abnormal rise of seawater level during a storm. And storm surge is measured as the height of water above the normal predicted tide. So I'm going to go to the right here so you can see it. So you see that green line, that's normal sea level. You have ocean surge, which is how high the ocean goes during high tide and how high it can go. And then you have the winds on top of that. So you have the winds, say you have a hurricane coming in from this direction, coming on shore. You already have the ocean moving inland, but then you have all those winds pushing it. So you have a lot of factors here that are creating a much higher ocean wave. So normal sea level, you can go up to about 3 feet with a tide. You can see a difference of about 3 feet. But during a storm, you can see up to 6 feet of water. Up to 6 feet of water, you go to the lower level of some of these homes, basements. That's why a lot of these houses on the coast are built on stilts. They actually have an open basement because they are prepared for storm surge. That's why a lot of those beach houses are up in the air on those stilts. They're not on the ground level because they could see major flooding if it was on the ground level. The problem is when you have a hurricane moving through, you could see 12 foot, 18 foot. I mean, it depends on how strong the hurricane is, but with a 12-foot storm surge, that's pretty much devastation to all the homes at the beaches. So when we forecast hurricanes, we're looking at storm surge as well as the winds, because obviously it's not just the winds causing damage, but it's also that storm surge, which could totally inundate those places, not only directly on the water, but even inland, even a block or two, 3 blocks, 4 blocks from the beach. Remember, you're mostly at sea level when you're living at the beach. You're not on mountains there. So even if you're fairly inland, you could be affected by the storm surge. Now, this is an overview of tides. We talked about high tide and low tide. So remember, the gravitational pull of the moon is almost bulging that water towards the moon. The gravitational pull. So you have high tide when the Earth is closest to the moon, and on the backside where the Earth is furthest from the moon. And you may be saying that doesn't make sense. Why is it on the front and the back? Well, the gravity pull on the high tide side here, closest to the moon, is because the gravity pull is stronger than on solid Earth. So the bulges of the ocean water get closer to the moon. Then on the back side, the gravity pull is weaker than on the solid Earth. So there's less gravity here, and that's why it's bulging away from the moon, because there's less gravity. So it's actually moving this way. So it's kind of counterintuitive because it's on the side directly closest to the moon and the side directly furthest from the moon where you have the high tide. Now, on the other sides of the globe, and remember, the globe is spinning. The Earth is spinning every 24 hours. That's why you get high tide, low tide, high tide, low tide. That's why you see that in a 24-hour period. But the sides, not directly in front of or in back of the moon, are where you have your low tide. So on this side of the globe and this side of the globe, that is where you're going to have your low tide. And again, that's when the water level is lower. Now, there's a couple things we look at with tides. You have low tide, which this is where when you first get to the beach, if you get there during low tide, you have a really big sandy place to play. The beach is very big. And then you put all your toys down. And then as you notice throughout the day, it starts getting higher and higher, and the waves get higher and higher. There's high tide. That is the highest point the tide gets, the ocean gets. And then you have the low tide. And then the distance or the amount of feet between the two, we call that the tidal range. So at some beaches, the tidal range is 3 feet. At some beaches, it's 1 foot. At some beaches, it's 2 feet. But certainly at some beaches, it is more significant than others, especially on the Atlantic coast, on the East Coast. The tidal wave, the difference between the high tide and the low tide is pretty significant. And if you've gone to Savannah, if you've gone to Tybee Island, if you've gone to Myrtle Beach, if you've gone to Charleston, you've seen the differences in the tides. Some places have gotten very devastated by the tides. In fact, a lot of the coastal cities really get hammered pretty hard. One of those instances was Hurricane Irma on the Georgia coast. That storm surge was 6 to 8 feet. So imagine that water coming up 6 to 8 feet. That's taller, most likely, than your dad and your mom. I'm just under 5'6", so that is way taller than me. So it's taller than an adult. That's how high the water was, taller than that. So it affected all the cars that were parked. It affected all the homes right there on the beach, and even homes that were well inland got affected by that. And today's trivia, and this was actually yesterday's trivia. I didn't get a chance to change it, but I will give you a trivia question. So we're going to around. Let's see. Let me find a hard one. What are the high tides and low tides created by? Are they created by the moon, the stars, or the sun? It's a little bit of a trick question because actually the sun has a little bit to do with it, but it's the moon. So ask your mom and dad later today. Ask them if they know what causes the tides and see if they know. And then post on here, have them post if they knew or not, because I'm curious if most adults know that. It's caused by the moon. So again, the areas that are closest to the moon, where the moon is at the time, are going to have high tide, and the area directly behind where the moon is and the areas on the side of it, that is where you have low tide. And that's why about every 6 hours you're going to see that tide changing. And the reason this is so important with hurricane forecasting is because it's going to make a significant difference on how tide the storm surge is. If the hurricane makes landfall during low tide, the storm surge is going to be a lot lower. But if the hurricane makes landfall during high tide, then that storm surge is a lot higher. And the higher the storm surge, the worse the devastation is going to be. So that's a general gist of storm surge and tides. If you guys love the beach, now you know a lot more about it. And it is crazy to think that it's because of the moon. Even though I've known that for all of my adult life, it's just those things you don't think about. They happen all the time. Just like it's kind of crazy to think about that the earth is constantly spinning and that it's spinning a full rotation every 24 hours. So let's see what questions we have. Hi Nola. Hi Butch. Butch, you watch all the time. I love that you're always watching. Let's see. Hi Paul. Let's see. What else we've got? Gravity causes a bulge in the water and also pulls the earth, so there are peaks on opposite sides. Hence to Bob, that's exactly right. You answered my, that was really good, Bob. Oh, we need closed captioning, Beverly. I wish we could do that. If this was on TV, we would definitely do closed captioning, but because it's on Facebook Live and we're all working from home, unfortunately, we just can't do that. But trust me, I would love that. Brenda, hi Brenda, thank you for sharing. Hi Bob, gravity. Exactly, it's the pull of the moon. That's what's causing it. Hi Susan, hi Patricia. I'm so glad you guys are watching. Also, please, if we start this lesson and it's something that you know your friends or your friends' kids are interested in, please share these lessons because I think they're fascinating, but I'm a weather nerd, so of course I find them fascinating. But I think this is good for adults to learn as well. It's a lot of refreshers and things maybe you learned in college or high school or middle school or even elementary school, but it's always good to get a refresher, especially on things that affect your day-to-day life. So that is today's topic, storm surge. Again, all week we've been doing Hurricane Week here on World of Weather. That is my biggest fascination in the weather world. I love thunderstorms. I love all kinds of severe weather, but hurricanes are certainly definitely the top of my list. Tomorrow we are talking about, let's see, tomorrow's lesson. We are recapping the 2019 hurricane season. We've talked a lot about hurricanes can happen outside of the hurricane season, but why they most likely fall between June all the way to November 30th. We talked about when they form in the ocean and where. We talked about where they make landfall. So tomorrow we're going to recap the 2019 season and maybe even talk about what we're expecting for the 2020 season. So make sure you join us on tomorrow's World of Weather. Everyone, thank you so much for watching. I love all of you. I love that you watch me each and every day. And I hope you all are getting something out of this every day. That is my goal, to at least give you some knowledge tidbits to take with you moving forward, since we're all stuck at home together. Everyone, have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow at 1:15.